The sun hung low over the empty fields, casting long shadows across the dry earth. It was a quiet land, a lonely land, where the wind whispered through the tall grass, and the only answer was the distant lowing of cattle. Here, in this forgotten corner of the world, lived a man named Ezekiel. He was a rancher, a man of the earth, with hands rough from years of work and a heart that had known too much sorrow. 20 years had passed since the sickness took his family, his wife, his little girl, even his brother who had worked beside him. The fever came swift and cruel, leaving Ezekiel alone in a house too big for one man. The neighbors had moved away. The town had grown distant, and the only company he kept was the Lord above and the beasts in his fields. Every morning, he rose before dawn, his bones aching, his breath fogging the cold air as he knelt beside his bed to pray. He asked for strength, for purpose, and sometimes, though he was ashamed to admit it, for an end to the silence. The ranch was his life. He milked the cows, tended the fences, and rode out to check on the herd as the seasons turned. The work was hard, but it kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering too far into the past. At night, he sat by the fire with his worn Bible, reading the same verses over and over, finding comfort in the words that had carried him through the darkest days. He spoke little, even to the few traders who passed through. They knew him as a quiet man, the one who paid in full and never complained, the one whose eyes held a sadness too deep for words. Then came the storm. It rolled in from the west like a great black beast, thunder shaking the ground and lightning splitting the sky. Ezekiel had just finished securing the barn when he saw her, a figure stumbling through the rain, her dress soaked, her hair clinging to her face. A woman, his breath caught in his throat. It had been so long since he had spoken to a woman that he nearly turned away, afraid he had forgotten how. But then she looked up, and her eyes, wide with fear and exhaustion, met his. "Please," she gasped, her voice barely louder than the rain. "I need milk for my mother." Ezekiel stood frozen for a moment, his heart pounding. He had not touched a woman in 20 years. He had not even stood this close to one. But the desperation in her voice stirred something in him. The same kindness that had once made him the first to help a neighbor, the first to offer a meal to a stranger. Without a word, he stepped aside and motioned her toward the house. She hesitated, her body trembling, her eyes darting as if expecting a trap. Ezekiel understood. The world was not always kind to women alone. He kept his distance, his voice gentle. "You're safe here," he said. "Come inside." The fire crackled as she sat near the hearth, her hands shaking as she accepted the cup of warm milk he offered. She did not give her name. She did not speak of where she came from. But Ezekiel did not press. He had learned long ago that some wounds were too fresh for words. Instead, he fetched a blanket, stoked the fire, and let the silence between them settle like the dust after a storm. Outside, the rain poured down, sealing them in that small, flickering circle of light. And for the first time in 20 years, Ezekiel did not feel quite so alone. The morning sun crept through the cracks in the wooden shutters, painting thin golden lines across the dirt floor of Ezekiel's cabin. Miriam sat stiffly on the edge of the chair where she had spent the night, her fingers curled tight around the empty cup Ezekiel had given her. She had not slept. Every creak of the house, every shift of the wind outside, had sent her pulse racing. Men were not to be trusted. She had learned that lesson too well. Ezekiel moved quietly around the room, his boots scuffing against the worn floorboards as he prepared a simple breakfast: bread, a bit of salted meat, a handful of dried apples. He did not look at her directly, as if afraid his gaze might frighten her. The silence between them was thick, heavy with things unsaid. Finally, he set the food on the table and took a step back. "Eat," he murmured. "You'll need your strength." Miriam's stomach twisted with hunger, but she hesitated. Nothing in this world came without a price. In her village, a meal meant a debt, a kindness meant a demand. She had seen men smile before they took what they wanted. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the bread. Ezekiel noticed. He turned away, busying himself with the fire, giving her space. "The storm's past," he said after a while. "If you've a mind to go, I won't stop you." Miriam swallowed hard. The milk, that was why she had come. Her mother was sick, feverish, wasting away in their crumbling hut at the edge of the next town over. The midwife had said milk might help, but they had no cow, no coin to buy any. When Miriam had heard of a rancher who lived alone far from the main road, she had taken the risk. Now, with the morning light pressing in, she felt the weight of her next words. "The milk! You said I could have some." Ezekiel nodded. I'll fetch it." He moved to the door, his steps slow, his shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible burden. Miriam watched him go, her mind racing. Why was he doing this? What did he want? She had heard stories of men who lured women in with false kindness, only to trap them. Her fingers dug into her skirts. She would not let that happen. Outside, the world was still damp from the storm. The air smelled of wet earth and grass. Ezekiel crossed the yard to the small barn where his 2 cows stood patiently. He took up a pail and began to work, his hands steady, his movements practiced. The rhythmic sound of milk hitting metal filled the quiet morning. Miriam stood in the doorway, watching. She had not followed him out, but she had not stayed inside either. Some part of her needed to see, to be sure he was truly alone, that there was no trick waiting. But there was only him, just a man, older than she had first thought, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into the sun. When he finished, he brought the pail to her, holding it out. The milk was fresh, still warm from the cow. "Here," he said. Miriam reached for it, her fingers brushing against his for the briefest moment. She flinched, pulling back as if burned. Ezekiel did not react. He simply let go, letting her take the pail without a word. For a heartbeat, they stood there, the morning stretching between them. Then Miriam tightened her grip on the handle. "Thank you," she whispered. It was all she could force out. Ezekiel nodded once. "God keep you safe," he said. And then she was gone, hurrying down the muddy path, her heart pounding, the pail clutched tight against her chest. She did not look back. Ezekiel watched her until she disappeared over the rise. Then he turned and walked back inside, the door creaking shut behind him. The house felt emptier than before. The fire had burned low. He knelt beside it, adding another log, watching the flames lick at the dry wood. He had done what was right. That was all. But as the day wore on, he found himself listening for footsteps that did not come, staring at the door as if willing it to open. The silence pressing again, heavier than before. And far down the road, Miriam walked, her thoughts a storm of their own. The milk sloshed in the pail, a precious weight. She should have been relieved. She had got what she came for. No demands, no threats, just kindness. So why did it feel like she had left something behind? I stop here. The days stretched thin and brittle after Miriam left, each one longer than the last. Ezekiel went through the motions of his chores, feeding the livestock, mending fences, tending the garden, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the woman with the wary eyes and the pail of milk. He told himself it was foolish to wonder about her. She had her own troubles, and he had no right to intrude upon them. Yet in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world was still painted in shades of gray, he found himself praying for her safety, for her mother's health, for whatever burden she carried that made her flinch at kindness. Meanwhile, miles away, Miriam knelt beside her mother's pallet, pressing a damp cloth to the woman's fevered brow. The milk had helped, but not enough. Her mother's breathing was shallow, her skin stretched tight over bones that seemed too prominent. The hut they called home was little more than a shelter against the wind, its walls patched with scraps of cloth and old hides. Miriam's hands shook as she lifted the cup to her mother's lips, coaxing her to drink. "You must rest," she murmured, though she knew the words were hollow. Rest would not fill their bellies. Rest would not chase away the sickness that clung like a shadow. Her mother's fingers, thin and trembling, closed around Miriam's wrist. "Child," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry leaves underfoot, "you cannot stay here. There is nothing left for you in this place." Miriam's throat tightened. She knew the truth of it. The village had turned its back on them long ago, after her father's debts had gone unpaid, after the rumors had spread that misfortune followed their family like a curse. But where could she go? The thought of returning to the rancher's land prickled at her pride. She had taken his milk and fled like a thief in the night. Why would he welcome her back? Yet as the days passed and her mother grew weaker, the answer became clear. She had no choice. The journey back was harder than she remembered. The storm had left the roads muddy and rutted, and the weight of her desperation made every step heavier. When at last the ranch came into view, the small cabin with its smoking chimney, the barn with its peeling paint, Miriam's breath caught in her chest. What if he turned her away? What if he demanded payment she could not give? She hesitated at the edge of the yard, her fingers knotting in the fabric of her skirt. Before she could muster the courage to step forward, the door creaked open. Ezekiel stood there, his silhouette framed by the firelight behind him. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the air between them thick with unspoken words. Then Ezekiel stepped aside. "Come in," he said, his voice rough but gentle. "You look like you could use a warm meal." Miriam's legs nearly buckled beneath her. She had expected suspicion, anger, at the very least questions. But there was none of that, just an open door and a quiet offer. Inside, the cabin was just as she remembered. Simple, clean, smelling of wood smoke and herbs. A pot simmered over the fire, filling the room with the rich scent of stew. Ezekiel motioned for her to sit at the table, then ladled out a generous portion, pushing it toward her without ceremony. Miriam stared at the steaming bowl, her stomach clenching with hunger, but she could not bring herself to lift the spoon. Not yet. "My mother," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's worse. The milk helped, but—" Ezekiel nodded, as if he had already known. "We'll fetch her," he said simply. Miriam's head snapped up. "What?" "If she's too ill to travel alone, I'll hitch the wagon. Bring her here." He said it as though it were the most natural thing in the world, as though he hadn't just offered to upend his solitude for a stranger. Miriam's vision blurred. She had spent so long bracing for cruelty that his kindness felt like a blow. "Why?" she choked out. "Why would you do that?" Ezekiel studied her for a long moment, his gaze steady. "Because it's what's right," he said at last. "And because once, a long time ago, someone did the same for me." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Miriam felt something inside her crack open, like ice giving way to spring. She bowed her head, her shoulders shaking. Ezekiel didn't reach for her. He didn't offer empty comforts. He simply slid the bowl closer and said, "Eat, then we'll go." And for the first time in years, Miriam let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't as cruel as she thought. The wagon groaned under the weight of the journey, its wooden wheels carving uneven tracks through the mud as Ezekiel guided the old mare down the winding path toward Miriam's village. Beside him, Miriam sat stiffly, her hands clenched in her lap, her eyes fixed on the horizon as if she could will the distance to disappear. The air between them was thick with unspoken thoughts, hers tangled in shame and fear, his in quiet determination. The landscape grew bleaker as they traveled further from the ranch. The trees thinned, their branches skeletal against the gray sky, and the huts they passed seemed to sag under the weight of poverty. Children with hollow cheeks paused in their chores to stare as the wagon rolled by, their eyes wide with curiosity. Miriam shrunk into herself, her shoulders hunched as if she could make herself invisible. Ezekiel said nothing, but his grip on the reins tightened. When at last they reached the outskirts of the village, a cluster of crumbling huts huddled together like frightened sheep, Miriam's breath hitched. "There," she whispered, pointing to a structure barely standing, its roof patched with scraps of tarp. Ezekiel pulled the wagon to a stop, his heart heavy in his chest. The inside of the hut was worse than he'd imagined. The air was thick with the scent of sickness and damp earth, and in the dim light, he could make out the frail figure of Miriam's mother curled beneath a threadbare blanket. Her face was gaunt, her skin waxy with fever. When she turned her head toward the sound of footsteps, her eyes, so like Miriam's, were clouded with pain. Miriam fell to her knees beside the pallet, her voice breaking as she spoke her mother's name. The older woman's hand trembled as she reached up to touch her daughter's cheek. "You came back," she murmured. Ezekiel lingered in the doorway, his presence an intrusion in this private moment. But then Miriam's mother turned her gaze to him, and something in her expression shifted. Not fear, not suspicion, but a quiet, weary recognition. "You're the rancher," she said. He nodded, removing his hat out of respect. "Yes, ma'am." She studied him for a long moment, her breath shallow. Then, with effort, she said, "You have a kind face." The words lodged in Ezekiel's throat. He had not been called kind in a long time. The journey back to the ranch was slow. The wagon weighted with more than just a frail woman bundled in blankets. It carried the ghost of Miriam's past, the weight of Ezekiel's promises, and the fragile hope that perhaps, just perhaps, this time, things would be different. Miriam's mother slept fitfully, her head resting in her daughter's lap. Miriam stroked her hair, her fingers gentle, her eyes never leaving the horizon. Ezekiel kept his gaze on the road ahead, but his thoughts were elsewhere, on the empty rooms of his house, on the years he'd spent alone, on the strange, unexpected turn his life had taken. When they finally arrived, the sun was dipping below the hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and violet. Ezekiel carried the frail woman inside, settling her by the fire where the warmth might chase the chill from her bones. Miriam hovered nearby, her hands twisting in her skirts, her eyes darting between her mother and the man who had, without hesitation, opened his home to them. That night, as the fire crackled and the wind whispered against the walls, Ezekiel found Miriam standing on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. He hesitated, then joined her, leaving a careful distance between them. For a long time, neither spoke. Then, softly, Miriam said, "I don't know how to thank you." Ezekiel shook his head. No thanks needed. She turned to look at him then, really look at him, at the lines etched by years of solitude, at the quiet strength in his posture. "Why?" she asked again, the question raw with disbelief. "Why help us?" He met her gaze, his voice steady. "Because everyone deserves a second chance." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Miriam's breath caught, and for the first time since she'd stumbled into his life, she felt something unclench in her chest, a knot of fear and distrust loosening just a little. And under the vast, star-strewn sky, with the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future pressing around them, something new took root. Tiny, fragile, but undeniably there. Hope. The seasons turned, as seasons do, with little regard for the hearts of men. Winter's grip loosened its hold on the land, and the first tentative signs of spring crept into the world. Green shoots pushing through thawing earth, the distant song of returning birds, the softening of the air that carried the promise of renewal. Inside Ezekiel's cabin, life had taken on a rhythm unfamiliar, yet not unwelcome. Miriam's mother, though still frail, had gained strength under the careful ministrations of her daughter and the quiet, steadfast care of the rancher who asked for nothing in return. Mornings began before dawn, with Ezekiel rising first to tend the livestock, his breath curling in the crisp air as he moved through the pre-dawn stillness. Miriam would join him shortly after, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, her hands still rough from unfamiliar labor, but growing steadier with each passing day. Together, they worked in companionable silence, milking the cows, gathering eggs from the hens, mending what needed mending. It was a simple life, but one that bore the weight of something precious, something neither dared name aloud. Miriam's mother, whom Ezekiel had taken to calling Mama Ruth with a gentleness that surprised even himself, spent her days by the fire, her hands busy with small tasks, mending socks, shelling peas, humming old hymns under her breath. In the evenings, when the supper dishes were clear and the fire burned low, she would tell stories of her youth, her voice weaving tales of a world that seemed impossibly distant now. Ezekiel listened with quiet reverence, his callous hands folded in his lap, his eyes occasionally flickering to Miriam, who sat with her chin propped on her palm, her expression unreadable in the flickering light. One such evening, as the first fireflies of the season blinked lazily outside the window, Mama Ruth set aside her mending and fixed Ezekiel with a knowing look. "You've been alone too long," she said, her voice soft but firm. The words hung in the air, heavy as the summer humidity. Ezekiel stiffened, his fingers tightening around the arms of his chair. Miriam's head snapped up, her eyes wide with alarm. "Mama..." But Mama Ruth waved her off, her gaze never leaving Ezekiel's face. "It's the truth, child. This house was built for more than one. The good Lord didn't put us on this earth to live in empty rooms. Ezekiel's throat worked. He could feel Miriam's eyes on him, could hear the unsteady hitch in her breath. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. "I reckon that's so," he said at last, his voice rough. Silence settled over them again, but was a different sort of silence now, charged, expectant, like the air before a storm. Miriam's hands trembled in her lap. Ezekiel stared into the fire, his thoughts churning. Later, when Mama Ruth had retired to her cot and the embers had burned low, Ezekiel found himself standing on the porch, the night air cool against his skin. The door creaked open behind him, and Miriam stepped out, her arms wrapped around herself against the chill. They stood side by side for a long moment, the only sound the distant call of an owl and the rustle of leaves in the wind. "Ezekiel," Miriam began, then hesitated. He turned to look at her then, really look at her, at the way the moonlight caught in her hair, at the stubborn set of her jaw, at the quiet strength in her eyes that had drawn him from first. She met his gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if—" But he never learned what she meant to say, because in that moment, the words that had been building in his chest for weeks finally broke free. "Marry me." The night seemed to hold its breath. Miriam's lips parted in shock. Ezekiel's heart hammered against his ribs. It wasn't a flowery proposal. There were no grand declarations, no promises of riches or ease. Just two words, simple and honest, hanging between them like a prayer. Miriam's eyes filled with tears. For a heartbeat, Ezekiel feared he'd misstepped, that he presumed too much. But then she reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his, and the world seemed to right itself. "Yes," she whispered. And just like that, the life they'd been building piece by careful piece clicked into place. The summer sun hung heavy in the sky, pouring golden light over the ranch as Ezekiel stood at the wooden fence, watching the cattle graze in the tall grass. His hands, callous and weathered from years of labor, rested lightly on the rough-hewn post. But his mind was elsewhere, back at the house where Miriam moved through the rooms with a quiet purpose that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. The wedding had been simple, just as they were. A few words spoken before the preacher, Mama Ruth beaming through her tears, and a shared meal under the sprawling oak tree that shaded the yard. Now, weeks later, the rhythm of their days had settled into something deeper, something that felt less like two separate lives and more like a single thread being woven into something strong enough to last. Inside, Miriam hummed as she kneaded dough for the evening's bread. Her sleeves rolled her elbows, flour dusting her apron. The kitchen, once a place of solitude for Ezekiel, now brimmed with life. Herbs drying from the rafters, jars of preserves lining the shelves, the scent of simmering broth filling the air. Mama Ruth sat at the table, shelling peas into a bowl, her fingers moving with a steadiness that had returned bit by bit since coming to the ranch. She glanced up as Miriam paused, pressing a hand to her stomach, her brow furrowing slightly. "Something wrong, child?" Mama Ruth asked, her voice laced with concern. Miriam shook her head, offering a small smile. "No, just—" She hesitated, then laughed softly, a sound like wind chimes in the quiet room. "I suppose I'm hungrier than I thought." Mama Ruth's eyes narrowed, then widened with sudden understanding. A slow smile spread across her face, but she said nothing, only returned to her task with a knowing glint in her eye. That evening, as the fireflies began their dance outside the window and the last light of day faded from the sky, Ezekiel sat at the table, his plate wiped clean, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. Miriam moved about the kitchen, her steps slower than usual, her fingers lingering on the back of his chair as she passed. He reached out, catching her wrist gently, pulling her to a stop. "Something's different," he said, his voice low. Miriam stilled, her breath catching. For a moment, she simply looked at him, at the lines around his eyes, the way the firelight caught in his beard, the quiet strength in his gaze that had become her anchor. Then, with a trembling hand, she placed his palm flat against her belly. Ezekiel's breath left him in a rush. His fingers flexed instinctively, as if he could already feel the life stirring beneath them. His eyes lifted to hers, searching, disbelieving. "A child?" he whispered, the word rough with emotion. Miriam nodded, her throat tight. "Come spring, That evening, as the fireflies began their dance outside the window and the last light of day faded from the sky, Ezekiel sat at the table, his plate wiped clean, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. Miriam moved about the kitchen, her steps slower than usual, her fingers lingering on the back of his chair as she passed. He reached out, catching her wrist gently, pulling her to a stop. "Something's different," he said, his voice low. Miriam stilled, her breath catching. For a moment, she simply looked at him, at the lines around his eyes, the way the firelight caught in his beard, the quiet strength in his gaze that had become her anchor. Then, with a trembling hand, she placed his palm flat against her belly. Ezekiel's breath left him in a rush. His fingers flexed instinctively, as if he could already feel the life stirring beneath them. His eyes lifted to hers, searching, disbelieving. "A child?" he whispered, the word rough with emotion. Miriam nodded, her throat tight. Come spring. The cup slipped from Ezekiel's grasp, clattering to the table, forgotten. In one motion, he rose, pulling her into his arms, his face buried in her hair. He didn't speak, couldn't speak, but the way his hands trembled against her back said everything. Mama Ruth, watching from her chair by the fire, wiped at her eyes with the corner of her apron. "About time," she muttered, though there was no bite in it, only joy. The months that followed were a blur of preparation and quiet wonder. Ezekiel found himself pausing in his work more often, staring at the horizon with a new lightness in his chest. He repaired the cradle that had gathered dust in the attic since his first child had outgrown it, sanding the rough edges until the wood gleamed. Miriam sewed tiny garments by firelight, her needle flashing in the dim light, her lips curved in a private smile. Even the ranch itself seemed to sense the change. The crops grew taller, the cows gave more milk, as if the land itself was rejoicing with them. Then, one cold night in early spring, when the first buds were just daring to peek through the frost, Miriam's cry pierced the stillness of the house. Ezekiel bolted upright, his heart in his throat, as Mama Ruth's voice called out, firm and steady, "Fetch the water, Ezekiel. It's time." The hours that followed were the longest of his life. He paced the porch, his hands clenched, his prayers silent but fervent. The midwife arrived in a flurry of skirts and calm authority, shooing him out with gentle but firm hand. Inside, Miriam's cries tore at him, each one a knife to his heart. He wanted to burst through the door, to hold her hand, to take the pain from her, but all he could do was wait, his face turned to the stars, begging God for mercy. Then, just as the first light of dawn painted the sky in pale pinks and golds, a new sound filled the air, a thin, wavering cry, strong and alive. The door creaked open. The midwife stood there, her face lined with exhaustion, but her eyes bright. "Come meet your son," she said. Ezekiel's legs nearly gave way beneath him. Inside, Miriam lay propped against the pillows, her face damp with sweat but radiant, her arms cradling a tiny, squirming bundle. She looked up as Ezekiel approached, her eyes shining with tears. "Josiah," she whispered. Ezekiel sank to his knees beside the bed, his hands shaking as he reached for the child. The moment his fingers brushed the baby's cheek, something inside him shattered and remade itself all at once. Josiah's face was red and wrinkled, his fists clenched, his mouth working soundlessly, perfect in every way. Mama Ruth, hovering nearby, placed a hand on Ezekiel's shoulder. "He has your eyes," she murmured. Ezekiel couldn't speak. He could only stare at this miracle, this tiny, breathing proof that love could bloom even in the hardest soil. Outside, the sun rose higher, spilling light over the ranch, over the family gathered in that small, warm room, over the future stretching out before them, bright and boundless as the dawn. Time, that relentless river, carried them forward through seasons of plenty and seasons of want, through laughter that echoed across the pastures and tears that fell silently into the soil they tended together. The ranch, once a place of solitude and silence, now brimmed with life, not just from the livestock that grazed its fields or the crops that swayed in the wind, but from the family that had taken root there like an oak planted by steady hands. Josiah grew like a sapling reaching for sun, first crawling, then walking, then running with the boundless energy of youth, his small feet kicking up dust as he trailed after Ezekiel through the fields. His hair darkened to the same rich brown as his father's, but his eyes remained Miriam's, bright and curious, always watching, always learning. By the time he was tall enough to grip the reins himself, he could mend a fence nearly as well as Ezekiel, his small hands deft with tools, his brow furrowed in concentration. Miriam would watch them from the porch, her fingers busy with mending or shelling peas, her heart swelling at the sight of her two men working side by side under the wide blue sky. Mama Ruth, though her steps slowed and her hands grew more gnarled with each passing year, remained the steady heartbeat of the home. Her stories became the fabric of Josiah's childhood. Tales of faith and perseverance, of storms weathered and blessings counted. She taught him to read from the worn Bible Ezekiel kept on the shelf, her finger tracing the words as his young voice stumbled over the syllables. And when the first snow of winter dusted the fields, it was her lap he curled into, her voice that lulled him to sleep with him older than the hills. The ranch flourished under their care. Ezekiel, with Miriam's keen eye for detail and Josiah's eager hands to help, expanded the pastures, repaired the barn until it stood sturdy against the wind, and even built a second room onto the cabin, a space for Josiah to call his own as he grew. Neighbors, once distant, began stopping by more often, drawn by the reputation of the family whose kindness was as abundant as their harvests. Travelers in need of a meal or a place to rest found welcome at their table, just as Miriam had all those years ago. And each time Ezekiel handed a weary stranger a bowl of stew or a cup of fresh milk, he caught Miriam's eye across the room, and the silent understanding between them needed no words. Years turned like pages in a well-loved book. Josiah grew tall and strong, his shoulders broadening, his voice deepening, until one day he stood eye to eye with Ezekiel, the boyish softness gone from his face. The world beyond the ranch called to him, as it calls to all young men, and though Ezekiel's chest ached at the thought of his son venturing out, he knew it was right. The morning Josiah left, his pack slung over his shoulder, his horse stamping impatiently by the gate, Ezekiel clasped his hand tight, his throat too full to speak. Miriam, her hair now streaked with silver, pressed a kiss to Josiah's cheek and slipped a small, worn Bible into his pocket, just as Mama Ruth had done for her so long ago. "Remember where you come from," she whispered. And then he was gone, riding toward the horizon, leaving behind the dust of his childhood and the love that would always call him home. The house grew quieter after that, but never empty. Ezekiel and Miriam found new rhythms to their days, slower, gentler, filled with the quiet contentment of a life well lived. They sat together on the porch in the evenings, watching the fireflies dance over the fields, their hands intertwined, their memories stretching out behind them like shadows in the setting sun. Mama Ruth passed peacefully one autumn evening, her breath slow like a clock winding down, her last smile meant for them both. They buried her beneath the oak tree where Josiah had played as a child, where the wind rustled the leaves in a constant whisper of remembrance. And when one day a rider appeared on the horizon, a man grown tall, with a wife beside him and a child cradled in her arms, Ezekiel and Miriam rose from their chairs, their steps no longer quick but sure, their hearts as full as the day they had begun this life together. The ranch, the land, the love, it would all endure, not untouched by time, but shaped by it, like a river smoothing stones, like a tree growing rings, like a story told again and again until it becomes part of the very air you breathe. And as the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky in colors too beautiful to name, the family gathered on the porch, 3 generations now, bound by blood and choice and something far deeper, and the silence between them was not empty, but overflowing. If this story of faith, love, and second chances touched your heart, follow for more timeless tales that celebrate the power of kindness and redemption. Like if you believe in miracles born from simple acts of love, and share this story with someone who needs a reminder that hope never fades. It only grows stronger with time. Subscribe for more heartfelt journeys where broken roads lead to blessings. And don't forget to ring the bell, so you never miss a story that stirs the soul. What lesson spoke to you the most? Let us know in the comments below. Turn on notifications. Your next dose of inspiration is just around the bend.